Well, to talk about Canada and China, we're now joined in studio by Vina Nadjibulla. Vina is a foreign policy expert, serves as Vice President for Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Vina, welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to see you again.
Nice seeing you too. So here we have the Prime Minister, accepting an invitation to go to China to meet with President Xi. The date still to be determined. But let's begin our conversation by talking about the potential here, because obviously Canada is looking for an alternate trade partner given what is happening with the United States. China presents itself being already this country's #2 trading partner. What does Canada have that China, People's Republic of China, PRC, actually wants?
Yeah, so let's get some of our numbers clear, Michael, because people say China is our second largest trading partner, but it's only 3.8% of our exports, right? So 76% to the US, 3.8 to China. So yes, it's numerically #2, but there's a huge gap. But China is an important economic partner, and of course it's also the second largest economy, and it's one of the most influential global powers. So therefore, having a constructive relationship with China, having dialogue with China at the highest levels is a good thing. So that's first point. In terms of what could we do more with them on, is there are sectors like energy, like oil and gas, LNG, where we could definitely be selling more to China. And now that we have TMX and we have infrastructure out west in BC, where I'm from, we can do more of that. But then there are sectors like canola where we're already too dependent on China, right? We're selling 67% of our canola seed to China. That kind of single market dependence, we have learned, is a vulnerability and a risk. It's a problem when it's with the US, and it's a problem with China.
Yeah, well, let me pick up on that point, because you're right. A lot of people focus on the benefit, because right now Canadians are trying to find an alternative market to the United States because we're not in control of what's happening in Washington, D.C. and Donald Trump. However, when you raise those things that the China PRC wants out of Canada, what is the risk? Because ultimately, when we're talking about China, we're not talking about a country that's a liberal democracy. We're not talking about a country that's a free market like our other G7 partners. So what is the risk of becoming too dependent, as you say, on the People's Republic?
Yes, so we need to make sure that we can trade with them in areas where we have room to grow. So I mentioned energy, there could be other things, but then in areas where we're already dependent, we have to diversify. So with China, the strategy is deepen where we can and diversify where we have to. So continue to de-risk, right? And China offers opportunities not just in our exports, but also the things that we buy from China. I mean, we're buying a lot from China. So in fact, we have a trade deficit with China. And of course, China would like to sell us a lot more as well. So we have to watch on what kinds of things we want from them and what would that do for our domestic markets. EVs is one issue. China would love to sell us their EVs. And there are some in this country who say we should be able to buy Chinese good quality EVs. So I think there is the commercial relationship, but then there's also the question of investments. A big thing that Prime Minister Carney was pushing for on his Asia trip was attracting more investment into Canada to be able to build the trade enabling infrastructure, to be building all the things that we need to make our economy more competitive. Now with China, again, we have to be careful because we're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, and if they were to invest in our critical infrastructure, in ports, in bridges, in cyber, that presents national security risks. And we have in place national security screening mechanisms that for now actually put limits on what we can get from China for things like critical minerals exploration and so forth. So I think as this discussion with China continues, and as we're seeing Prime Minister Carney kind of make this moment of a turning point, so we're changing direction, he wants to see more engagement, then there's lots of questions on exactly what kind of engagement, what do we want from China, and what are the red lines that we still want to keep? What kind of national security screening do we still want to have in place, or what kind of investment from China are we welcoming?
I want to pick up on a couple of the points there. You use the terminology red line, and also you use the example of EVs. And EVs is something that China seems very vested in getting more of into Canada. What is the risk of that? Because it's also been suggested that it may be somewhat of a Trojan horse to allow that into this country when it comes to industrial policy and security.
Absolutely. So you exactly named the right sort of risks there, Michael. There are economic security risks in terms of what would that do to our auto sector in general and nascent EV sector that we're trying to build. So, and what does that do to our conversations with the US in terms of maintaining an integrated North American auto sector? Now, those conversations are difficult. And if in due time Canada decides that we can't have an integrated auto sector with the US, then that opens up options for discussions with China. But we need to sequence those conversations correctly. Then, in addition to those economic security concerns or concerns about our overall industrial strategy, then there is the issue of national security and the fact that EVs are basically computers on wheels, right? So, and there's going to be issues around data and protection. So those potentially could be managed. Now, there are countries that are saying in Europe that they can manage those, but nonetheless, it's a conversation and a process. It's not just to say, oh, China is pressuring us on canola, so let's remove the EV tariffs to be able to get export market back for our canola product, which is important. So my point is that with China, we can't be looking at these quote-unquote irritants, which is how the statement, the readout from Prime Minister Carney's meeting noted. We can't be looking at these irritants in isolation. We have to look at the broader picture of the kind of relationship we want with China and how are we going to make sure that we have some leverage to be able to maintain our red lines and protect ourselves.
Yeah, do we know the kind of relationship we want with China? Because oftentimes I feel like the cart is before the horse on this one. Because historically, when you look at it, even long before what happened with Meng Wanzhou and Huawei, this country has vacillated between yes, pursue trade with China versus be concerned about the human rights abuses and the security risks that China presents. Do we know what type of relationship we want?
That is such a good point, and there's really been at least like 4 or 5 other resets with other prime ministers who sort of come in and say they want to have a new type of relationship with China. And you're right, there's generally this kind of dichotomy of do we do business and trade with China or do we focus on human rights and other concerns? And I think we're now living in a world in which we can't just look at this kind of through a black and white, right? The question is not do we engage with China? The question is how do we engage with China? What are the areas in which we should be pushing for cooperation? And what are the areas which are no-go, right? And then even a more difficult point becomes how do we actually ensure that that's what actually happens, right? Like we can say that's what we want, but then China gets a vote and China has a lot more leverage. So once we come to the table, how do we actually protect our red lines with them? Because China links issues, so they don't want to just talk about trade. They also want us to have the right kind of attitude on issues that they care about. And by that, I mean Taiwan, for instance, or the issues of South China Sea, or generally human rights treatment. So China wants compliance in exchange for good relations. We in Canada have resisted that until now. The question is, can we continue to resist given that the context has changed? I think the bottom line, Michael, is that nothing about China's Communist Party's behavior over the last 7 months has changed. What has changed is the context in which we are now finding ourselves as Canadians, and we're trying to navigate that better. So the behavior hasn't changed. China still represents a lot of challenges, but we now need to be more pragmatic and find opportunities even in difficult relationships. But it's a really difficult balancing act.
Difficult balancing act. We'll watch to see how the Prime Minister proceeds on this one. Vina, really appreciate the insight. Thank you for this.
Thank you.